Hey, folks, I'm Robb Wolf. I am a 2 times New York Times best-selling author, and you should be listening to the Hack Life podcast with Joel Evan. It is the best show going, so check it out.
All right, I'm here with Robb Wolf. He is a former researcher, biochemist, and 2 times New York's Best Times Wall Street and Journal best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. He has got a new book out with his co-author, Diana Rogers, called Sacred Cow. There's also a movie which explains why well-raised meat is good for us and good for the planet. Robb, welcome to the show, man.
Huge honor to be here. It's almost like we've been here before.
For those of you who don't know, Robb's alluding to the fact that we may have had a podcast scheduled about a month ago where some technical difficulties, let's just say. So now we're back for round 2, but it's going to be even better. I think we'll probably talk about something completely different. So who knows?
Absolutely. Good to see you again.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just kind of start off. Everyone, knows you and just your history in the health world, starting back from the paleo days, and that's where I really started finding you because I started going down this. I was like, "What is this paleo diet, and why are people talking about it, and why does it make so much sense?" And you were someone who was a pioneer, really spearheaded a lot of the early days. But I'm just curious now because with keto and carnivore and all these new modalities, like, what's shifted for you? And in terms of since the paleo days, what any big shifts, or how has your mindset maybe changed since then?
Yeah, it's interesting. So even back when I did my first book, which was published in 2010, it was very keto oriented. We just didn't have it in the name. It wasn't, part of the zeitgeist at that time. Not the way that it was, say, like 4 years ago. Like keto was just like the super popular thing. But if folks have read that book, or if they thumb through it, they'll see that I recommended adequate level of protein, keeping carbs, at least in the beginning, under 50 grams of effective carbs per day, and then kind of rounding out the rest of the caloric needs with fat, and trying to go from mainly whole, minimally processed foods, and an eye towards nutrient density, which once you do that, then things like grains and processed foods are just very low down the priority ladder, and I think that's a pretty credible place to start all of our nutrition conversations. So it's funny because folks are like, "Oh, you're the paleo guy, and then you became the keto guy." And it's like, well, it's actually been pretty consistent. Probably the biggest change that's occurred over time. And I guess I'm the person who coined the term the autoimmune paleo diet. Like, I only had a paragraph in my first book about it because the book was already quite long and I couldn't get in really flesh it out. But there have been, 8 or 10 randomized controlled trials now on the autoimmune paleo diet. Dr. Terry Walls has really popularized different iterations of the autoimmune paleo diet approach. And what's interesting to me about that is that the carnivore scene has been really fascinating in that, in theory, I'm kind of like, one of the gut autoimmune experts in this whole ancestral health world. And when I saw the results that folks were getting with a carnivore type approach, I was just jaw dropped, because it was people who had gone from like standard American diet to low carb to paleo to autoimmune paleo to keto. And they usually had some sort of stepwise improvement, but they were typically still sick, until they went full carnivore, no plants of any kind, or very, very minimal. And then you had people who were basically crippled who were made well, and it was crazy because I remember I was supposed to give a talk at California State University, Chico, part of their hospital system there, Enloe Hospital in Chico. And there was this doctor that really didn't like me, had never met me, but, it just kind of looked at it, given my stuff a sniff, and really didn't like me. And what this doctor would say is, that's the guy who recommends an all meat diet. And at the time I was, appalled. I'm like, no, look at all these vegetables, and, it's by weight and by calories, it's actually a plant-based diet and all this stuff. And funny enough, a lot of the niggling remaining gut issues that I had, because I got into all this because of developing ulcerative colitis and also discovering that I have celiac disease, this autoimmune gluten reactivity, and shifting to a paleo keto type diet helped enormously, but I still had a lot of gut issues. And over the course of time, as I've minimized the amounts and types of vegetable matter that I eat, my gut issues have gotten markedly better and some other health issues have improved. So that's probably been the largest change, is this, one of the, it is this trending towards a carnivore type approach, carnivore-ish. It's interesting because one of the, I guess, cornerstones of paleo type thinking is a recognition that certain plants have anti-predation chemicals in them. Like grains don't really want to be eaten, legumes don't really want to be eaten.
Yeah.
So there's an understanding of that as kind of like a ground floor buy-in in paleo land. But then it seems like this really crazy leap that there may be some people out in the population that are also reactive to, things like kale and spinach and stuff like that, and just that fiber in general may not be the best thing in the world for certain people, which I've certainly discovered that to be true. Like soluble fiber, like you can get from rice and things like that, seems to be okay. Insoluble fiber, like a raw salad, is about the least friendly thing I can throw in my gut. Like a bowl of refined E. coli might be worse, but it's a funny thing. So that has easily been the largest change that I've seen over the last say like 5 to 8 years, and has been the most profound change from the beginning of my career to this point.
Yeah, very cool. What I'm curious, is your ulcerative colitis, is it like, could we say it's healed, or like, does it?
I mean, it's in remission. Like when I've been checked out, then I have no signs and symptoms of the disease. I do still, I'll have some kind of IBS type stuff occasionally, where and I usually tend to the looser side of things. Like I've never really had a problem with being constipated. But what's interesting again on that is that if I really pay attention to the amount and type of plant material that causes that kind of gut irritation that makes me loose, if I stay under some threshold, then I have, the Bristol stool chart. I'm pooping like a champ and everything's good. And it's really weird for me. And I've noticed this with other people. If you're pooping well, everything else goes well. Like I would get up and feel pretty good, and then I would do my business. And if it was on the loose side, I would feel like shit afterwards. And I think that there's actually like an electrolyte driven piece to that because of the loose stools and everything. And maybe we could dig into that. But it's I just notice that if I'm pooing well, like if they're formed and it's not too loose, I feel good. And then if there's something wrong with that stuff one way or the other, then I feel less well. And
That's fascinating. I mean, and a lot of the health coaching I do too, and a lot of the practitioners I'm surrounded with, we talk about this idea of what it's really interesting for you just to say from my personal experience, because we talk about this idea of the drainage funnel. And if you're not draining, which really means what you're saying, if you're not pooping, like honestly, like twice a day, 2 to 3 times a day, then that means your drainage funnel is backed up. So when you think about brain fog or lethargy, or just like you said, I just don't feel as good. It's like, wow, it's no surprise, because if that's backed up,
I would push back a little bit on the frequency deal. Like even within a mixed population, the frequency can be anywhere from like 2 to 3 times a day to as infrequent as every 2 or 3 days for people, falls within kind of normal bowel movements. The really important thing there is that when you go within that Bristol stool chart deal, it's the proper consistency. It's well formed, but not too like desiccated and dry and all that stuff. And that is one of the difficult things to get hemmed in. Like, so people will get used to this idea, well, I need to go poo like 2 to 3 times a day. Maybe that's a sign of consistent gut irritation. And you should, for you, like your ideal, if you're not over irritating your gut with like fiber or whatever it is, then maybe your optimum is once a day or once every other day or something like that. Like I would push back on that a little bit, in that I think that there's a much larger, there's a scary degree of variation there, because you have one person who really is healthy and they're going twice a day, and you have another person who really is healthy and they go once every 3 days, and you're like, what the fuck? Like this, you know, these
Yeah.
are orders of magnitude
Yeah.
different, and they may be entirely okay.
And yeah, 100%. It's interesting too, because I would usually only go once a day. Now we're talking about poop, but I would only go like once a day. And I noticed, especially when I was like doing a lot of intermittent fasting, I just never had the urge to. And I like, I thought, like you said, I was fine. So for one practitioner to say, well, you should be going two times a day, it's like, I feel great. My gut, you know, I can't say really anything bad. So you're right. There's that individuality. But yeah, it is interesting though, just from your perspective, when the drainage funnel's backed up, then we see a lot of things backed up. So, and then the other thing before we talk about electrolytes, because I do want to talk about that, because you may know a thing or two about electrolytes. You mentioned about fiber. I just saw like a new meta-analysis come out. I think Dr. John Jaquish posted it. It's not his study, but he was talking about fiber and how they just did a recent study showing there is absolutely no correlation between like high fibrous diets and like, you know, health and colon cancer. And it's funny. And now I'm reading Dr. Gundry's new book, The Keto Code, and I'm underlining some parts where he's like, high fiber or people with a high fibrous diet have shown, you know, he's quoting another study. So there's so much confusion. I think really it's like, who's right on this one, right?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that was most compelling for me in that whole thing, and I wrote a piece, I think we still have it available. It's kind of, I did it maybe 4 years ago, but it was kind of my thoughts on the carnivore diet writ large. But I was like, okay, there's all this back and forth on like, is fiber good? Is fiber not good? There's this thought that if it is good, it's good for some stuff that it's providing the gut. You know, like it can be a substrate for producing short chain fatty acids and those things. Butyrate is very similar to beta hydroxybutyrate, very similar to this ketone body. And I don't think there's any doubt that those short chain fats are beneficial for health when you can get them. But I was thinking there's this whole population that doesn't even have the real estate to make that stuff. And it's people who have had ileostomies, that have had the tracts, either their colon and or their large intestine removed for injury or various health issues and whatnot. So I started poking around and looked at what is the morbidity and mortality of people with ileostomies. And you have to keep in mind, those people have either been sick or injured to a degree that they get a major surgical intervention, which removes a chunk of their digestive tract and all that type of stuff. And what you find is these folks don't live shorter lives, they don't live unhealthier lives. And they don't even have the fucking real estate to ferment fiber. Like if there is any perceived benefit anywhere, they don't even have the tissue to do it. And there was no issue there. And that was really one of the things that got me thinking. I'm like, this is interesting. There's something interesting here. And I will say, I think that there are folks that seem to thrive on a higher fiber diet and they do really, really well with it. And then I would say that it's almost like you know, two sides of one fence. You know, it's like you either seem to do well with a high fiber diet or it seems to do really terribly, but you've been told that you need to eat that high fiber diet your whole life and you've just been trying to square peg round hole that thing the whole time. But I think it's really a matter of some highly individual circumstances, like maybe your gut microbiome and some genetics. And I think that can change over time too. Like somebody who did well on a high fiber diet, if they get some sort of a gut pathogen like Giardia or a case of food poisoning or something like that, oftentimes they will notice that they don't do as well with certain foods that they used to be fine with. And maybe you can recover that, or maybe your gut is just forever changed. And I think that that's something that gets missed in the story, is that what worked for you yesterday may not work for you today, and you may need to get in and modify things.
Yeah, it almost sounds like it's okay to learn new things and try new things and change. Like, hey,
maybe,
you know, maybe, right? Yeah, like we're allowed to do that. You know, that's why it's bothersome too when you're the paleo guy. I thought it's like, well, what worked for me then doesn't. I'm aging. I'm doing different things. My lifestyle changed. My family, like things change, right? You move, you go to different places. So, the key for me is like we're always learning, we're always growing. So, and you're allowed to do that, right?
Right. And somewhere along the line, you're going to make some mistakes. And you know, that is where doing some amount of documentation about what you're doing, you can make that a little bit more objective and quantifiable, instead of just totally seat of the pants, for sure. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about electrolytes. I'm a super huge fan of Element, your company,
Nice.
LMNT, guys. You can see Robb's, if you're watching on video, you can see he's got the gear. So I kind of fell into, so I'll let you talk about it, but Element, just for anybody who doesn't know, it's electrolytes. It's like big deal, Joel. Like, what do you care about? Why is it this brand of electrolytes? But I've been finding it with a lot of my clients, and then just with athletes, and then just people with fasting. I like to use it as a way to fast a little bit longer, but not bump me out of my fast. And I'm super bullish on it. But yeah, can you kind of just talk about like how you went down this rabbit hole of electrolytes, and really why you see them so fundamental, and maybe something that we're missing in our routine, our diets?
Yeah. And I mean, this is a good example of even if you are kind of an expert in an area, you never know everything. And it's always good to have smarter friends around you, because I've eaten kind of a lowish carb, paleo, keto type diet for 23 years now. And I do well on that cognitively. And for most of my physical activity, I do pretty well with it. Like for low intensity activity, I can just go all day long. Like if I'm hiking or something, like I just really don't have an off switch with that. For weightlifting type things, I do fine with a lower carb diet. But for things like CrossFit or jujitsu, I do some old guy jujitsu, and it's been historically hard to fuel jujitsu because it's a glycolytic type sport. And even though I try to do a very relaxed, non-attribute type of game, like it's just the demands of that are different in such a way that it's historically been difficult to fuel for. But there's a piece to that I didn't realize, which was that people eating a lower carb diet really need more electrolytes, specifically sodium. And it was in poking around trying to figure out how to make my situation work that I met these two guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, the co-founders of Keto Gains. It's this online boot camp based, keto intervention that these guys have been doing for years, and they just get these remarkable body composition changes in both men and women, and people that their hair isn't falling out, and the women aren't becoming amenorrheic, like they're not breaking people in the droves. And when I got in and figured out what they were doing, it was a very adequate protein approach. So they weren't like the fat first approach to keto, which are people now that are in keto land that are as afraid of protein because of mTOR and cancer and aging as like a raw vegan. And it's just absolutely madness. And so they understood the need for adequate protein, but they really understood the need for adequate sodium and electrolytes in general. So it's kind of a long story, but I eventually got my shit together. They told me to track my sodium. I figured out they wanted me to be at about 5 grams of sodium per day. I was consuming less than 2 grams of sodium per day, which was likely part of the reason why I felt like shit all the time. And so,
and Rob, on that note, isn't that what the FDA recommend? Like the recommended daily dose is 2 grams. And I think I've heard you say, like, I think we're closer to probably wanting to be around 5. So
yeah. And so within low carb spaces, you definitely need more. Within, interestingly, any type of minimally processed dietary space, you likely need more, because the place that people typically get sodium is from processed foods. So, anytime somebody cleans up their diet, usually they feel kind of off. There's kind of like a keto flu type of phenomenon with it, is because they're getting, if they're eating minimally processed foods, they're getting lots of potassium, which is good. They're getting lots of magnesium, which is good. But if you don't receive adequate sodium, you will feel horrible. Like the body really wants a certain ratio, and it can adjust things. Like the kidneys can excrete more of one thing and retain more of something else to try to maintain that. But you can, and oftentimes will, feel pretty terrible. And so it seems like a minimum of about 5 grams per day for most people. It both correlates best to the minimum levels of morbidity and mortality. There was just a great study looking at all-cause mortality, and about 5 grams per day was there was a U curve. And so if you were lower than 5 grams per day, your death and illness was higher. If you were started getting higher than about 5 grams per day within a mixed population, then you started seeing problems. And that's worth mentioning. Like if you're in an athletic population or you are an athlete, your sodium needs maybe double or triple what the baseline is. Like
Wow.
we've done some work with, you know, NHL, which is kind of an interesting sport. Even though it's out on ice, they wear a lot of gear, and it's very hot, and it's a very active, explosive kind of sport. And these guys are pretty big. They're not huge, but they're 200, 210 pounds. Like they're pretty big athletic guys. They will lose 10 pounds of water and 10 grams of sodium in a hard practice or a game.
Wow.
And I mean, it's a massive amount. And if they are following their dietitian's advice of getting fewer than 2 grams of sodium per day, because that's heart healthy, and they're losing 10 grams per day, I mean, you know, if we make this in like dollars and savings accounts terms, like they're bankrupt pretty quickly, you know. And a similar thing happens metabolically, and this is where people end up exacerbating overreaching, overtraining, dysregulated cortisol. When we have too low of sodium intake, then we have a lot of these metabolic problems that we usually ascribe to overreaching, overtraining, and that sort of thing. One of the most profound things that we see when people get the electrolyte amounts and ratios right is their sleep improves, their heart rate variability scores improve, their recovery improves. If your recovery improves, you can train more often at a higher intensity and therefore get better whatever it is that you are doing. So the electrolyte piece is just this really crazy important foundational element to all this. And it's worth mentioning that if somebody is put on like a medically supervised low carb diet, they will by hook or by crook be recommended to consume adequate electrolytes, specifically sodium. But it's worth mentioning that, you know, within popular diet circles, and I'm guilty of this, I had all the protein, carbs, fat pretty on point, and, you know, the amounts and types of ratios of that. But somewhere along the line, the need for sodium and electrolytes really fell off my radar. I wasn't afraid of sodium. I've known for a long time that insulin was likely the main driver of hypertension and high blood pressure, not sodium. But at the same time, I was neglecting the fact that I would be more optimized, and the folks that I work with would be more optimized if they got adequate electrolytes and sodium.
It's so phenomenal because I was just reading Dr. David Perlmutter's book, Uric Acid, and he's, you know, talking about, and like you just mentioned, you know, hypertension, diabetes, any of these metabolic issues, the doctors are actually telling you, stop it, stop, you need to lower your salt intake, like stop it. I mean, unless someone's in this, you know, this hypertensive kind of state, I mean, even then, I mean, is salt still the villain?
The funny thing is, so there are sodium sensitive hypertensives where if they consume a fair amount of salt, they will see an uptick in their blood pressure, and that's not great. But these same people are put on low sodium diets, and their blood pressure also doesn't really go down, which is kind of the, you know, the interesting thing, because the main driver of hypertension for the bulk of those people is chronically elevated insulin levels. When our insulin is chronically elevated, overeating, too many calories in general, too many refined carbohydrates all kind of lead into this insulin resistant state. But when our insulin is chronically elevated, we tend to retain sodium. We upregulate this hormone called aldosterone, and aldosterone causes us a tendency to retain sodium. So more sodium isn't necessarily great for the sodium sensitive hypertensive, but it also a zero sodium or sodium restricted diet doesn't really fix things. And that is due in part that the body will just pull sodium out of our bones. So it's not really fixing the issue. And then there's some percentage of hypertensives out in the population that it's actually caused from low sodium consumption. So that low sodium causes the body to enhance aldosterone and angiotensin production, and it'll increase epinephrine, which causes you to retain sodium. And so these people will actually see their blood pressure drop significantly when they consume adequate levels of sodium. So there's kind of an interesting mixed bag of stuff out there. But one thing that we know for sure is fasting and lower carb diets across the board lower blood pressure in folks, and it's mainly acting at that kind of insulin interface. So you know, if And it's understood to the tune that, if somebody is, if for whatever reason, doing a medically supervised fast, like they make sure to get adequate electrolytes because the person is in danger of passing out and like, having a traumatic brain injury from the fast and the low blood pressure. So sodium is definitely a factor in hypertension. It's a secondary or tertiary factor in this thing. It's not the primary driver. And when you make it as if sodium is the primary driver and you try to treat the issue by addressing only sodium, then you don't really fix the problem. Oftentimes you end up worsening the problem.
Yeah, love that you said that, because I've even found with a lot of my clients, even when we do some modified fasting and stuff, and I have them use the element as an additional, because there's some fasting, like you mentioned, can do electrolyte dumping and the kidney. So I see people do just anecdotally very well with it. Right. And can you also speak? I believe, from what I've read too, and even seen with clients, that sodium actually helps turn on the brain, like kind of kick it up, and also reduce cravings. So can you speak on that, or am I right about that?
No, you're right on line. And as we're recording this, the Huberman Lab podcast just had a piece on salt and sodium and really some fascinating stuff. I mean, on the brain and neurological drive part, I've been aware of that for a long time. Every activity in our body is governed by sodium potassium pumps. Like if people remember like their high school or maybe college biology, ATP cycle, Krebs cycle, that's all at the end of the day. The thing that we're trying to do is push more sodium outside of cells and more potassium inside of cells, so that when they go to equilibrate, that kind of stored energy, like water behind a dam, is captured, and we're able to produce energy from that. Every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse is driven by these sodium potassium pumps. And other than pH, the most tightly regulated physiological process in the body is arguably electrolyte status. If you go a little high, a little low, like you're going to feel bad and potentially even die. And there are long-term compensatory mechanisms. Again, like if we long-term are deficient in sodium dietarily, we can pull it out of the bones. But when we pull sodium out of our bones, we also pull calcium out of the bones. And that may be one of the drivers of osteoporosis and problems there. So that need for sodium for neurological drive is really huge. And there aren't a ton of studies on it. Like, we're definitely a little bit more in the anecdotal world, but frequently what people will notice is they may feel like they're a little tired, a little off. Oh man, I would sure like a cup of coffee, cup of tea, some sort of stimulant. And what they find is if they do some sort of electrolyte, specifically sodium, and this can just be as simple as like pickle juice or like 10 olives, but get about a gram of sodium in your system, all of a sudden, like that lethargy and the brain fog is kind of gone. And we notice that, like, if somebody's doing kind of a neuro-based strength program, they have much more recruitment and ability to kind of get that high motor unit recruitment better. If you're doing more of a bodybuilding type approach, then you get more of a pump with adequate sodium. So the sodium for that cognitive function, for neurological drive, and I'm thinking about it more from like physical performance, but I think it would probably apply also for just cognitive activity for sure.
Yeah, nice. And then how last question on electrolytes really is like, how do people know, or how should they know, like what's like maybe some signs that they know, like, hey, I'm not getting it. If I'm just a regular athlete, like you said, that's probably pretty obvious. And like yourself, an athlete and doing jujitsu, and you see like, man, I'm bonking a lot here. I just don't have the output. But how are other people, maybe will they know, am I getting enough electrolytes? Should this be something I start adding into my routine?
Yeah. Lethargy, fatigue, brain fog are the kind of earlier symptoms. If one is cramping, you've gone super far down the deficiency kind of spectrum. And once you get to the point of cramping, what it tells us is you've had at least minutes, maybe hours of suboptimal performance, because you've been cratering through your inadequate electrolyte status. And the first things that go are like fine motor skills and a lot of that fine cognitive functioning, for tactical details and should I go left or right, or things like that. So the kind of end stage is significant cramping, and it gets worse beyond there. But once you hit the point of cramping, like if you find yourself in a physical activity and you're cramping, you have so mismanaged your electrolytes that you have been running suboptimally. Like if you're an 8-cylinder engine, you've been running on somewhere between 2 and 4 cylinders for a long time. And preceding that, brain fog, lethargy, fatigue, elevated heart rate typically. So all these things that are really ergolytic, that are cutting or damaging your performance. The bugger with like the brain fog and the lethargy, it's kind of a little bit like being drunk. Like you're becoming sloppy and stupid and making bad decisions, but you don't necessarily know that you're being sloppy and stupid and making bad decisions. So it's happening on a slow enough time course oftentimes, and because you're how does your brain know when it's cognitively impaired when it's the thing assessing itself? There's a weird feedback loop on that. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. I wanted to just talk a little bit about your documentary. Yeah, it's a book too, but Sacred Cow. I find it just so fascinating what you and Diana Rogers have done, and I know it's a masterpiece of like 4 years in the making of what you guys have produced. But yeah, can you kind of talk? I think especially right now, we're in this crazy time where meat is just being I don't know what's the word, but it's being just thrown out like it's the worst thing for you. It's causing cancer. It's all these things. And you guys actually have a different point of view. Can you kind of talk about that? Yeah. How that came about?
Yeah. I mean, yes. And like the vilification of meat has only gotten worse. Now meat is like the primary driver of climate change. And oh, by the way, everything that's driving climate change is a social justice topic. And if you don't 100% buy into the dominant narrative around climate change, then you're a horrible person and you don't care about social justice issues. And it's just like on and on and on. And then during COVID, it was this thing where social justice, climate change, and COVID were just interchangeable. There was a World Economic Forum video that it literally was like this word salad where you could just, it didn't matter which one of those things you threw in there, you could put it, and those seem like remarkably different things: infectious pandemic disease, social justice topics, and right. Greenhouse gas driven climate change. But they're completely interchangeable, which I think possibly should be suspicion raising in people. But it paints me as kind of a conspiracy guy, I guess. But to even suggest that, but Diana and I saw a need for this 10 plus years ago. It's just when we first started thinking about a book first, and then it occurred to us to do a film, there weren't enough people on the planet that cared or knew about regenerative ag at all to even make this thing a viable go. But it was about 6 years ago, I guess maybe even longer than that, 6-7 years ago, that I felt like we were getting close and that it was worthwhile to start working on the book so that by the time we were done, then maybe we would be at the early stages where there would be enough people to care about this thing. Because I've been early on a lot of things. Like, it's great to be able to look around corners and see where trends are going. But if you're 10 years too early on a trend, you're not really doing yourself or anybody else any favors on it. And so we started working on the book, realized that a film would be really handy because there have been a number of kind of vegan based documentaries, Cowspiracy, Game Changers. The Game Changers one was the one that, Arnold Schwarzenegger was in it, and it's supposed to be these athletes he's going vegan. And he says he's 80% vegan, which is, God, it's just so
so
unethical.
Is what you're telling me.
Yeah. So that's basically his deal. And so, our virtue signaling is tied into like how vegan we are. 80% vegan, which sounds remarkably like paleo. It's like 20% meat, 80% plants, whatever. but there was just no narrative pushing back against this idea that there are basically three areas. There's long been this notion that like meat causes cancer, meat enhances type 2 diabetes, that it's bad for health. There's this other piece that meat's damaging to the environment, that it uses a ton of resources, and it, literally this picture is painted that cows just like put straws into the Colorado River and like drink it dry. And there's all this land that, oh, woe is us, if only we used it for something other than cattle. And then there's this food that gets used to feed cows in particular, that would be better used feeding humans, and it is some of the pushback. And then finally, there's this ethical piece. Is it okay to kill animals, to eat them, versus killing them as part of your factory combine going through to get your soybeans and killing millions of animals? Is that okay? So all of that stuff had to be unpacked. And so basically the book and film dig into the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat inclusive food system. And we go through and we have all these assumptions, beef is a water hog, uses too much water. Well, what's the real story with that? For even conventional meat, 95% of the water used with that beef is what's counted is the water that falls on a grassland that makes grass grow. And then the animals eat that grass. Now, there's either going to be cows that eat it, elk that eat it, or nothing that eat, or locusts that eat it, or nothing that eats it. Yeah. In which case the grassland becomes less healthy. Like if a grassland is not grazed, it actually turns into desert. So it's portrayed as if we are stealing water resources from one place that we could use it better somewhere else and apply it to these animals. But most of grasslands, so 2/3 of the Earth's landmass are grasslands. Most of that area is not amenable to cropping. Like it's too hilly, it's too rocky. Most of the stuff that could be crop or farmland we've already converted it. Some forested land can be cut down and turned into either crop or grassland. And there's kind of push one way or the other. Many people think that we should rewild things, that we should not eat animals, we should not raise animals in this concerted way, and we should just let nature go crazy and do what it does. And I would say that this is why most of the Western states have been burning down the last 10 or 15 years every summer, because they have a non-interventionist approach to grassland and forest management. So where used to they would go in and log some trees and cut down undergrowth and do preemptive burns, which is actually part of the natural ecosystem there. Now they don't do any of that, and so the whole thing burns down like once every 50 years, and nobody gets anything out of the stuff. And this is a little bit similar to the way that we approach the food production side. So we have this erroneous claim around water. The water that's used for beef in particular, now chicken and pork is a little bit different because they are intensively raised in these confined area feedlots for their whole lives. But even Costco, Walmart beef, conventional beef, it spends 70% of its life on grass. Like it only would take a little bit of a shove to make it fully grass-based. But even then, a lot of what these animals are fed is like crop silage. So after a wheat field has been harvested, they let the animals go through and eat the leftovers in the wheat or the cornfield, the leftovers from ethanol production, either industrial alcohol production or actual like human consumed ethanol. And that's all great utilization of resources. If you're going to make booze, then the leftover spent grains, you either compost it, burn it, or feed it to animals. And feeding it to animals makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of details and a lot of nuance in that story that you could really paint the production of ruminant animals in particular in this very negative light. The water use, the land, oh my gosh, all this land is being used for it. Well, you can't really use it for anything else. It's a grassland. It is best used as a grassland, and grass co-evolved with ruminant animals. So you either graze it so the whole ecosystem is healthy, or you let it lie fallow and it becomes a desert. And this is an interesting thing. The Audubon Society is, in the last 10 years, become a real fan of regenerative agriculture because the bird species populations have exploded in these areas that have regenerative ag occurring. And that's usually a great indicator that if these bird species return, then the ecosystem at large is much healthier. But I mean, I've been jabbering for 5 minutes, just trying to unpack like two small pieces, the water and the land part of cattle, you know, and that's just a small part of kind of the resource allocation piece of this. And then we still have all of the health, all of the rest of the regenerative, you know, environmental piece, and then also the ethical piece. So the book ended up being, when we turned it in, it was almost 600 pages long, got whittled down to just a hair under 300 pages, but it's pretty accessible. Like it definitely is a little bit more of a technical book. Like if somebody is not ready to go super deep on that stuff, that's where the film is really valuable, because it covers all this material, but more in kind of an emotive story-based format that I think is pretty powerful. But there was just no credible pushback to these claims, you know, and so that was really what we felt like we needed to do. And the irony is that we've had virtually no pushback from like the vegan scene at all. Like there's no significant takedown articles or anything. I think we did such a good job of we really tried to dot our I's and cross our T's. Like we didn't make any spurious claims, it very evidence-based, and we were really careful about what we did. Like we've had crankiness from the regenerative ag scene, because one of the topics in there is pastured beef more nutritious than conventional beef? And the best research we can find, there's barely any difference. Pastured beef has a little bit more omega-3 fats, which people get all spun up about, but you would need to eat 8 pounds of beef to get the same amount of omega-3s as you get in 3 ounces of salmon. So like beef is just not your place to go for omega-3s. But meat of all kinds is incredibly nutrient dense. It's high in protein. It is high in essential fats in general. It's loaded with iron. It has zinc. It has magnesium. It's very nutrient dense. It's highly satiating. So if you eat more of that, you tend not to eat more of other things. There's all these really laudable characteristics to it, but it's not shockingly more nutritious than pastured versus conventional meat. Pastured dairy is much more nutritious. Pastured eggs are far more nutritious. Wild-caught seafood is far more nutritious than farm seafood. But there's just this reality that cows, and in particular, but also to some degree sheep, are just really good at taking low-quality food and ramping it up and turning it into high-quality food. But I think because we were so diligent in not making false claims, like there's not a lot of footholds for the vegans to get in and get cranky about that. But oddly enough, we've had crankiness from the kind of meat elitist regenerative ag scene. Like it's usually white women who own a ranch or are associated with the ranch and feel like we didn't do a good enough job on XYZ thing. And those have been the people that have been the most cranky towards us and the most critical, even though we are basically like the only individuals out protecting what these folks are up to. But that has been the pushback by and large.
You actually want more of them. That's actually what you want. But I think if that's the only pushback you got, then you did a hell of a job.
It is frustrating as hell though. It makes you just like, why did we even bother doing it?
You missed it, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious. One of the things that surprised me or shocked me, I was like, huh. And again, like we were talking about earlier, like I'm always learning too. I want to I never want to say like, I'm only this way. I'm keto. I'm carnivore. I want to be able to learn more and do everything. But one of the things I think I remember hearing Diana say is that she said, hey, like we actually need to double the recommended daily requirement of protein. And I always hear this stat thrown around by everybody, all the health people. If you want to if you want to just get your average protein, you want to be about 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Or if you're someone trying to build muscle, yeah, it's close to that, or even like, let's just say 1 kilogram per pound. So I walk around 150, 155. So then I need 155 grams of protein based on that. She was saying like, I think we need to double it, like 1.6 kilograms. And I'm curious, like, do you see the same thing? And then what about the whole, you mentioned it earlier, mTOR and IGF-1, everyone's saying as we age, as guys like you and me are getting older, we don't want that. We want to lower IGF-1. What are your thoughts just from what you've been reading?
Yeah. And I am old, so you'll have to remind me to circle back. So let's put a pin in the IGF mTOR thing.
Okay.
And Diana is way better at this than I am. Like, so I'm going to do a very poor Diana Rogers imitation here. But what ends up happening is that when you look at the stable nitrogen, you know, like we consume some food and we see how much nitrogen we retain, which is kind of our lean body mass and muscle mass and whatnot. That is kind of where these recommendations around protein intake have been made, and they are too low in general. But then what happens is that the United States doesn't use the metric system, which is appalling and should be a reason for self-flagellating embarrassment for all Americans. But because we suck at math and we don't know the metric system, we've dumbed this thing down where they just make the Dietetics Association just makes a blanket statement. They say women should get about 40 grams of protein per day and men should get about 60 grams of protein per day, because they're going off of some sort of like a 1950s idealized, you know, size of human beings. Like they're saying the average woman is 120 pounds and the average man is like 155 pounds. And it's actually about 40 pounds off on both of those, you know, like everybody is way larger at this point. And although it's not an airtight hypothesis, there's this protein leverage hypothesis that puts forward this idea that in general, organisms eat to a protein minimum. And if we eat enough protein, we will tend to not overeat other calories, either carbohydrate or fat. And if we undereat protein, we will tend to overeat these other calories. And so what's happening is that men and women are being told to eat about 1/2 to 1/3 of the protein that they should be consuming. But it's weird because when you look at, well, how much should it be? Should the recommendations be based off of body weight? They're pretty close. They're a little skinny, but they're pretty close. But then what the real recommendation is based off of this like idealized body weight, which doesn't represent anybody. And so people are grossly under eating protein. And that's where the doubling comes in. So what Diana's recommending isn't that you should be eating 300 grams of protein. It's that the on the books recommendations would suggest that you only need about 40 to 60 grams of protein when you really need more like 120 to 150 grams of protein. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. And then, yeah, could you just and then are you able to kind of talk about that whole mTOR and IGF-1? I always hear like, yeah, you know, protein's anabolic. It's telling our bodies to grow. Cancer's not anabolic, but cancer is an organism that is growing rapaciously without, you know, it's never stopping. And so they correlate that to IGF-1 levels. And so as we age, we should be doing more fasting. And so I'm just curious. Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, just in general with protein intake and IGF-1 and aging, if they're.
Yeah. So I wrote my first kind of starry-eyed piece on intermittent fasting in 2005. And I thought that like some amount of intermittent fasting and protein cycling and everything would be right at this interface where you could kind of optimize performance, health, and longevity. And there might be a little something to that, but I think by and large, like almost all of the calorie restriction research is bullshit. Almost all the fasting research is largely bullshit. And here's the thing for this, and I am completely in the minority on this currently, although I've seen some people like the Atiyahs and stuff like that start to make some shift. But what are they always comparing? They're always comparing a sick population with a fasted population. They are never, ever, ever comparing a phenotypically optimized healthy population eating a species appropriate diet and comparing that with intermittent fasting and calorie restriction. They never do this ever. And so literally this is like all of caloric restriction research, like Mark Mattson and Ray Walford, who was in the Biodome and all this shit. Like all of this research has looked at animals that have been raised in an environment in which they are chronically overeating. It's understood that for most lab rodent models and most lab models in general of animals, you have to underfeed them or they will die early of chronic degenerative disease because of the shitty nature of the food that they're being given and their tendency to overeat on these diets. Like this is just well understood in lab science. There are certain studies that they have to figure out how to feed the animals in such a way so that the animals live long enough to see the outcome of this study, because you don't want them dying from cardiovascular disease due to the way they're being fed. And so I think it's just this, and they'll do some of the calorie restriction in like roundworms and different things like that. And they're like, oh, see, like protein restriction, it doubled or tripled their lifespan and whatnot. But again, it's in this chronically overfed laboratory setting. What we haven't seen many examples of this, but a couple of examples exist. So one thing, as an aside, not all organisms experience a longevity boost from caloric restriction. Many do, but some don't. And all the circumstances that we've documented so far in which we see enhanced longevity is in a laboratory model comparing lab-fed animal overeating with lab-fed animal caloric restricted or fasted. There are some of these animals don't experience enhanced longevity, and one of the prime examples of that are wild type animals that have brought out of the wild, put into a lab, and then fed a calorie restricted diet, and they don't get enhanced longevity out of that. And those animals also tend to not overeat the lab food. It takes multiple generations for them to get trained into overeating the lab food, which I think is a whole interesting aside on that. So you got that stuff. So I did this talk. It's called Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard? And it's the talk that I did right at the beginning of 2020. I only did it at the Metabolic Health Summit, and then COVID hit, and I didn't do it publicly beyond that. But if you want to dig that up and link it so that your folks can watch it, it's a 1 hour thing, and I go through it in a much more succinct fashion. But I just, the long and short, I think that this stuff is mainly bullshit. Again, the thing that needs to be compared is a healthy, lean, metabolically healthy population fed a species appropriate diet versus a calorie restricted population. Which one of those is going to do better? And I think that what we see is in wild type animals fed a calorie restricted species appropriate diet, they die early, because organisms that live in the wild that are underfed die early. They don't make it. That's a piece of things. Another piece of things is a little bit more observational, but all of this hubbub about lower protein, particularly in aging individuals, the one thing that we see consistently across the board with aging populations is those folks who consume more protein without over consuming calories age better. They are stronger, they maintain better muscle mass, they have better cardiovascular disease endpoints, and they have lower, all-cause mortality. Their health span, lifespan curves end up looking much more similar. So they tend to get old and then die versus having a protracted illness. So if there was something really magical to this, calorie restriction and fasting and whatnot, I think that we would see that there. And I could make, maybe there's a benefit once a quarter, maybe once a month, you do like a 24-hour or 48-hour fast. But I am suspicious that if people are lean and healthy and eating a species appropriate diet, more or less, they're doing resistance training 2 to 4 days a week. I question whether any fasting above a very minimal baseline would be beneficial at all. And here's the reason why. It is completely speculative that calorie restriction or fasting will prevent cancer. There is some suggestion that you may actually be screwing up some of the cancer sensing mechanisms there. What people forget is mTOR is mTOR complex 1 and mTOR complex 2, and these complexes plug into the immune system in really succinct ways. And mTOR complex 1 has to be activated in order for most cancer to be recognized. So if you were suppressing mTOR complex 1, either via rapamycin or fasting or calorie restriction or protein restriction, then a cancer cell could grow and proliferate without the immune system recognizing it, because you need that first stage of mTOR activation. So this is where you want mTOR turned on and then turned off, and you want some sort of a randomized pulsatile fashion.
Yeah.
Without doubt, overfed organisms have chronically turned on mTOR, and that's bad. But that's entirely different than an adequately fed organism that is strength training and doing cardio. And, okay, maybe you do some compressed feeding window. Maybe every once in a while you do 24 hours or maybe even 48 hours. But I just think that the return on investment with that fasting, it drops off so quickly once an individual is lean and healthy. And so it's speculative that the calorie restriction and all this fasting and stuff is going to prevent cancer, Parkinson, Alzheimer's, all these chronic degenerative diseases. But we know for certain that all of us aging will face age-related sarcopenia. We will lose muscle mass and bone density as we age.
Yeah.
We will lose the large motor fibers that determine strength and power and whatnot. And that is guaranteed, and it is totally predictable. And the way that you forestall that is strength training and adequate protein intake, period. So I am so nervous about this crop of people that I see folks in their 40s and they're like dark circles. People in the ancestral health scene that are so protein phobic now that they look like folks that you would normally see at a raw vegan conference. They're like dark circles under their eyes. They don't have a scrap of muscle mass on them. If their car drove off an embankment and they had to climb up and hike out to save themselves, they would be incapable of doing it. And that is supposed to be like leading to health and longevity. I just think it's bullshit. And I know that was a completely like neurotic, like shotgun splattering. That talk, Longevity We Trying Too Hard, walks through this in a much more succinct fashion. But yeah, that's my take on that stuff, and clearly nobody's really going to know for quite some time. But I think that people, massive amounts of money, massive amounts of resources have been dumped into something that I think ultimately is going to be pretty much a dead end. Like if intermittent fasting is a way that people can manage overeating so that they don't chronically overeat, great. But I see a lot of people who are already lean, already pretty active, and then they're sticking in tons of fasting and high intensity training in a fasted state. And I think that all of that is foolish and potentially disastrous over the long haul.
Yeah. Wow. Love it, brother. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, again, I'm always amazed. I'm like, I don't know what I don't know. Like you just keep going. I know we're running up on the hour.
And I could be full of shit on that. Like maybe all the Peter Attias and Rhonda Patricks and all that are right about this stuff, but it doesn't square with any other element of evolutionary biology. And this is where I think the hyper mechanistic reductionist angle that some folks like that take, and I'm not trying to shit talk them, but I think this is where, like, yeah, look at these complex mechanisms and then just take a big step back and run it all through an evolutionary lens. Like, from an evolutionary perspective, does this make sense? And let's make some predictions around this stuff. And at the end of the day, my main takeaway is, if somebody's asking, should I do an additional day of fasting per week, and they're not already doing 2 to 4 days per week of strength training, do the strength training, and do the cardio at first. Get all that stuff dealt with, and then maybe every 21st day you do a 24-hour fast or some time restricted eating or something, and really keep an eye on your performance. Like, how many max pull-ups do you have? How many times can you deadlift body weight in a minute or something like that, and have some work output oriented benchmarks, because that gives insight into how long you're going to live. If you've still got a lot of work capacity, then you've got to hedge against the sarcopenia, against cardiovascular disease, all these other things. And also that makes your life better today. That's kind of the interesting thing, is it's probably going to be the thing that wins this long-term event of optimized aging, but it also guarantees that you're living optimally today. Whereas so much of the direction that I see people taking overactive fasting and protein restriction, all this stuff, your life kind of sucks today in the hopes that you may be alive later so that your life can kind of suck a little bit then as well. And it just seems preposterous to me.
Yeah. And I love it. I mean, also, I think what I've noticed, the longer I've been in this health game, and not into the extent that you have, but I find it so, in talking to people like yourself and other researchers and doctors, is that a lot of these studies are slogans, in my opinion. They're like a headline and we run with it. And it could be that slogan. The China study, for one, is like one that was blasphemizes like meat, right? And says it causes all these cancers and stuff. And when you look at it, when you actually look at the study, that's not true. And you just very eloquently put out, like, let's do a different study showing people that are calorie restricted in an optimal age, that are optimal health, and do the same. Like, no one's doing that. So the studies are in many ways rigged in a way that gives us these results. So thanks for bringing light to all that, man.
Totally. And again, I may be full of shit, but it's I've seen the big players in this show slowly start to drift away from the, more fasting is better, suppress mTOR at all costs. And so it's interesting. I think in 10 years, like the Peter Attias and the Rhonda Patrick type folks are probably going to, I suspect, look a lot more like what I'm suggesting here, but maybe not. Maybe I've got the wrong of it. Yeah.
We'll see. We'll come back in 10 years.
Yeah.
I know we're like running at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have time to just kind of go through some like lightning round questions? I don't know what your time schedule is.
I'll do my best. I suck at short answers, but I'll do my best. Yeah.
They don't have to be short, by the way, but they're just kind of like in a more rapid fire. But before I do that, anything that I didn't ask you that, I mean, I'm sure I could ask you, so we could go on for this could be the Joe Rogan pod. We could go for 3 hours, but is there anything that I didn't ask you that you kind of wish I had?
No, I really super appreciate talking about both the regenerative ag piece of this, and then also the this health fasting, longevity stuff. Like people really geeked out on it, and rightfully so. Like I'm not excited about the prospect of dying. I'd like to stay in the fight as long and as well as I can, but I do think that folks are overcomplicating that story. And again, I could be wrong, but I think that, so my wife and I do a little bit of disaster preparedness stuff. Like, we live in an area that wildfires could just like lay waste to the neighborhood that we live in. Not much earthquake, not much other stuff, but wildfires could be a really big deal. So we did some preparedness of like having some food on hand, some water on hand, like a go bag, couple of things like that. But we did it in a way that was fun for the family and enhanced our quality of life now. And if things get squirrely, we've got kind of a fallback that we'll streamline our lives if we needed to, like throw the kids and the dog and the cat in the car and just like split because a wildfire is coming this way. And I see that a little bit similarly. Not all decisions in life lend itself to improving your quality of life today while also providing a hedge later. But if you can find things where you can improve today while also hedging against tomorrow, then I think that's great. Whereas so much of what we're being asked for in this health and longevity space, this protein restriction, calorie restriction, and everything, they're asking you to give up some percentage of your quality of life today in the possibility that it may buy you more life tomorrow. And again, the more life tomorrow is still going to be at the suboptimal level that you're having to do today to perpetuate the whole thing. So it just doesn't make sense to me, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Love it. All right, let's do some lightning round questions and we'll wrap this up. Yeah.
Cool.
I'm curious, if the old you could see the new you, what would the new you say?
So basically, like, if my younger self could give me some advice today,
or if you right now, what would you tell your younger self?
What would I tell my younger self? I would tell my younger self to broker less bullshit. And this is a funny thing. When I was younger, I looked at the people kind of ahead of me in the health space and even within research, and I was like, God, it's just a bunch of crusty old assholes. Like nobody can get along and everybody's all backbiting and fighting and everything. And then as I've gotten older, maybe I've become a crusty old asshole. And but what I've realized is that there are more things that are important to just kind of stand up for and to get right, because there's squirrely shit that people just kind of throw out, and they have like kind of incomplete or unsophisticated thinking on something. And even for myself, if I've got something wrong, I would really like somebody to kindly, but like, hey, Rob, I think you have the wrong of this. Here's how I think this thing goes. I'm like, oh, okay. And it gives me an opportunity to unfuck myself then. And so I think that I did put a lot of energy into building bridges and trying to build community. And in some ways, what I did is I created opportunities for people to have significant reach and platform. And these people ended up not being ethical, not being particularly smart, not really providing much value, but I allowed for a situation for them to kind of set up roots and to thrive in a way that really hasn't done the world all that much good. And so I would be a little bit more of a selective prick about who I give a hat tip to and who I think's work is good, honestly.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Okay. I love that. I've never heard that.
Which will make me very popular with people, but yeah.
But I think too that, I don't know, as I've gotten older, you just really value your time too. And you value, like what you're going to dedicate energy to. Cause and when you're younger, it's like, you'll say yes to everything. And yeah, you just want to be around it. But it's like, now it's like, I've done that, or I established myself. I don't have to do this anymore. And then you start to kind of see the differences. So yeah.
Yep. For sure.
I'm curious, like, what are some choices that you made that you think made you who you are today?
I definitely made some choices. Like when I worked for CrossFit, I was getting paid really, really well to do stuff that I enjoyed, but we did things in a way that the way that we ran our business was totally different than the way that CrossFit basically educated people to run businesses. They didn't educate people the way to run a gym. It was just like, here, grab a broomstick and start training people, which was horrible. It was great for CrossFit Inc. It had a short-term deal because they were running it like a Ponzi scheme. They didn't care if a ton of people, if somebody down the road from you, a quarter mile away, had a name that was virtually identical, because so long as people kept certifying and opening gyms, then CrossFit Inc. was making money. But we knew that that was a dead end street. We knew that it was terrible for the clients. We knew it was terrible for our coaches. We knew it was going to ultimately be bad for us as business owners. But I was getting paid really, really well at that time. And all I needed to do was keep my mouth shut and I'd be good. And I just couldn't, because I knew, and in part of this is a well-run brick and mortar gym is, to me, like for ages, I've said the gym is primary care medicine. Like once you go to the doc in the box, once you go to the clinic or whatever, that's secondary and tertiary care medicine. Your primary care medicine is sleep and food and exercise and community. And what better place to get that than some sort of a CrossFit type gym where people have their heads screwed on straight and they're not crushing people, And so I early on recognized too great of an importance for these gyms to succeed. It was over 10 years ago that we did the pilot study with the Reno Police and Fire Department, where we identified their highest risk people within the police and fire population. We got them on a low carb paleo type diet, got them doing some CrossFit type activity, modified their sleep. That pilot study saved the city of Reno $22 million with a 33-to-1 return on investment. And my dream was that we would roll this thing out to all gyms like that. And we would have an insurance product attached to it. And we would start creating incentives for people to really be healthy, not the bullshit like corporate health stuff that we generally see today. But that was never going to come to pass if I just kept my mouth shut and I saw kind of the abuse of people that was occurring within CrossFit to occur. So I spoke up and we got kicked out, and it was rough. We had legal battles back and forth with CrossFit and everything. Ultimately, we ended up winning all that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it sounds like a prickish thing to say, but I was right about everything, the business models, the need for not scaling, but progression, and like all this other shit. I was right about all of that. And at the end of the day, I think that CrossFit Inc. is in this very precarious spot now. trying to kind of find itself. They're trying to revamp and redo some things, but they're still not really focusing on building businesses. They're still focused on certifying people. They're not really providing support and infrastructure to make these businesses successful. And if the businesses aren't successful, they fucking go away. And then you don't have somebody paying you your yearly association fee and all that type of stuff. So that's a thing that both short and long term, I would have probably been far wealthier, and I would have had a lot less headache had I just kept my mouth shut and figured out a way to just grift off of that system that was easy and right in front of me, but ethically I just couldn't do it. And I'm hopeful that at some point in my life, all of that comes back around and we're able to really plug into these micro gyms, the things that I think really would change healthcare and improve medicine for the better.
That's awesome. Sounds like, and it kind of ties in with your first answer, broker the bullshit, right? Do it sooner.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
stand,
Honestly.
stand
Yeah.
up for your, stand up for what you believe in and faster almost and
Yep.
align with your true self, and good things happen. I'm a big reader. Are there like a top like 1 to 3 books or any books that just jump out at you that you recommend and someone else read just because it had a lot of impact in your life?
Oh man. I mean, I know it's popular right now because the movie came out, but I do a lot of sci-fi and kind of fiction reading, and I think that is valuable. For me, I get a lot of insights, from reading fiction like that, and particularly where there's like some science fiction, some econ, and different things baked in the cake. So I would say Dune is an amazing book if people haven't read it. My parenting style is built all around the Gom Jabbar, where Paul puts his hand into that box, and like if he pulls it out, it means he's an animal and he's going to die, and I'm not going to kill my kids. But I tell my kids this story all the time, like, to the ability you are able to maintain decision making, stay in your body, in your head, and you make decisions, you don't react like an animal, you will be more or less successful. And I think that is a very broadly applicable thing. Then there's another book called The Mandibles, and this is a near future book that looks at when the US loses dollar reserve currency status and the economic implosion that happens as a consequence of that. And it's a hilarious book. It is dark humor, and it also, you will learn more about economics than most PhDs in econ really come away with in a practical setting. It'll also curl your toes a little bit, but if you're into dark humor and a little bit of doomsday bunkery like thoughts around like the Federal Reserve and the dollar and economics and everything, it's a just masterfully written book. Lionel Shriver is the woman who wrote that, and it is just brilliant. And she's British, and it is just this thick British dark humor through the whole thing, because you're tracking this family that goes through this implosion of our economic system and what it does to them individually and at the family level. And it's both horrific and amazing at the same time.
Kind of feels like something we might be going through right now, but I mean,
it's very timely. It is very timely.
Get your Bitcoin ready, guys.
Yeah.
Last 2 questions, then we'll wrap it up. Any rituals or hacks or practices that you do on like a regular basis?
I do as much as I can daily meditation, like 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes usually in the afternoon. I'm consistent about training and sleep. Like I really prioritize sleep. I think I prioritize sleep almost to a fault. And like my kids are now 7 and 9, and we homeschool, so we don't have to deal with like the team sport thing. But like my youngest daughter's jujitsu runs a little late. Ironically, the older kid's jujitsu wraps up earlier than the younger kid. But
yeah,
when our kids were like 2 and 4, we'd have them in bed by like 6:30 at night.
Yeah,
my
I know.
wife,
I remember that.
Wipe our hands, and we had 12 to 13 hours of just like freedom after that, and that's all gone now. Like the kids want to stay up later, and so I think so I do the meditation and all that stuff, and then I think I just turned 50 this year. I do old guy jujitsu. I still feel like I maintain a pretty good work output across the board, and it's mainly because I protect my sleep. Like I will sacrifice a lot of other stuff to make sure that my sleep is on point, because if my sleep starts getting degraded, like everything else falls apart.
What for you? I mean, I'm curious, what does that mean to protect your sleep? For you, it has to be a minimum of 7 hours, or like,
I'm
what do you
probably
aim
more of
for?
an 8 to 9, and like earlier is better versus later. I just come out more rested. I will pass on some social engagements in lieu of, going to bed. I don't do it all the time because like life is short, and like, there's only, so many friends' birthdays that you're going to be able to attend and all that type of stuff. So I'm not a complete shut in, but I don't do spurious stuff like where we might, as a family, we might decide, hey, do we want to go out to eat? And I'm like, no, I'll whip something together really quick, because the 30 minutes to drive to the restaurant, 30 minutes to get to see, it's like, it's going to be this like 4-hour affair versus I could have us fed, watered, done. And oh, you know what? Another kind of ritual that we do in the evening, the family, we wind down by doing some some stretching. We dial the lights down, and then we listen to books on tape. And so
Huh.
we'll listen to like an Audible tape. We're going through the Harry Potter series right now. We love it. The kids love it. And we've just been fortunate to find this series of books, but it allows us to spend some time together as a family. We get a little bit of media, but it's not like TV and screen.
Yep.
And we all do a little bit of mobility and stretching and kind of wind down. And then again, that facilitates going to bed early. Like
Yep.
everybody's tired and they're ready to go to bed, and we're not like doing a bunch of really stimulating stuff right before winding down ultimately. Yeah.
I love that. Last but not least, where can people find you and the good folks at Element?
Element, you go to drinkelement.com, and we have amazing blog and content over at Drink Element. I do a lot of writing there, but we have a bunch of folks that do writing for that. RobbWolf.com is the main place to track me down, I guess. I have social media presence, but I post things and then I don't look at it later. Like I should just turn the comments off, because I most of the comments are not worth reading or experiencing anyway, but I leave them on because it helps the algorithm to get stuff out there. But I just one thing that I did 3 years ago was took all social media off my phone. And so I've just been in this pruning process. And so I'm at a spot now where if I feel like I've got something to say, so one, we've got the Healthy Rebellion Network, which is a paid community that folks are a part of. And then if I feel like I've got something more broadly to say, I have a Substack, I'll put it on the Substack, and then I will push that to social media. And it's interesting, what I've found is even the process of just needing to put in an email on Substack cuts out 99% of the dicks. It's just like that level of buy-in, to say nothing of like needing to pay like, $30 a month to be part of like the Healthy Rebellion. But it's, I actually enjoy interacting with people and enjoy the back and forth. I learned an enormous amount interacting with people. And this is one of the hazards, I think, of completely decoupling off of media and social media, is that if you have 1,000 people that are really engaged with what you are up to, you're going to have people that read the article you didn't read and talk to the person you didn't talk to, or listen to the podcast you did. So I may throw something out there and it may be like 80% baked, or maybe it's 20% baked. But then these people who care about me and care about the relationship be like, dude, Robb, have you heard about this, this, and this? I'm like, no, I didn't. I trust them. They trust me. There's this great, crowdsourced process there. And it works great when it's functional, and it will destroy Western liberal civilization if it continues to happen the way it does on like Facebook and Instagram, where you have an algorithm that pits people against each other.
Yep.
I just stuck my nose into Instagram it was like a week ago, and there was a person who posted something that I thought was absolutely ridiculous, and I commented on it. I tried to do it respectfully. But I have just like stuck my nose in there like 3 times in the intervening, maybe like 4 weeks. Every fucking time that person is in my feed, it's the first thing that I see. So the algorithm is like,
Yeah.
oh, we got a dopamine hit off that. And I'm like,
Mhm.
fuck you. Like, I'm not going back. I'm not doing it again. Even though each time I see this person, I'm like, oh my God, you idiot,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm like, no, okay, I get what's going on there. But I've really decoupled off of social media. And it's tough, because how do you reach people these days? How do you build a platform and an audience? Like podcasts, I think, are still good because they kind of work around that system. But man, what a nice venue to do some clips about important things, put it on social media, and then maybe people get interested in it and you can pull that in. But yeah, it's a shit show. It really is a bona fide shit show. Yeah.
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 And it'll stress you out. So you gotta, there's a balance I found myself too.
For sure. Yeah.
Awesome, brother. Well, thank you for being on the show, and I appreciate you so much, man. Thanks again for a second time.
Thank you. I enjoyed both of them. Like the first one, we came out of the gates and it was like, you asked some amazing questions, and I was actually like lucid that day, and we had some good stuff. So I think we pulled it together pretty well today too.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Awesome.